Oh, hold on. So I guess we can start now. Thanks so much for joining in. My name is Carlos de la Torre. I am the director of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida. And for us, it's very important to have a discussion today on what are the meanings of the referendum that just happened in Chile. The title of today's event is Constitutional Change: Undoing Pinochet's Legacy and Democratizing Chile. So we have two experts that are going to explain us why was there a need to have a referendum to see whether or not and how to change the constitution that Pinochet put in place in Chile. What are the prospects that we will have for the democratization of society? And, to explain us how the Chileans got to this moment. So we have two very well-known scholars. The first one, and she will talk for like 25 minutes first, is Claudia Heiss. Claudia Heiss' latest book is Why Do We Need a New Constitution? It was published in Spanish. She has an ample trajectory of working on issues around constituent processes in Latin America and in Chile. She teaches at the University of Chile. She was the president of the Chilean Association of Political Science. She has a PhD from the New School for Social Research, and she is the chair of the Political Science Department, I think it is, at the University of Chile, or of the major of political science at the University of Chile.
The undergraduate program, right?
The undergraduate program, thank you. The other speaker is Cristobal Rovira Kaltwaser. Cristobal is a professor of political science at the University Diego Portales in Santiago de Chile. And he has a PhD in political science from Humboldt University of Berlin. And his areas of research has been populism. He has been extremely productive in terms of all kinds of articles on populism and editing the Oxford Handbook of Populism. And recently he wrote with Cass Populism, a very short introduction that was published in English by Oxford and has been translated into several languages. Cristobal also has work on the right in Latin America. So we have a fantastic panel. So after each of them talk for about 25 minutes, we will give them a space to have a conversation with each other, and then we will open the floor to questions from the public. So thanks so much, Claudia and Cristobal, for giving us your time. And so let's start with you, Claudia.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you. I want to thank first the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida for putting this panel together, and particularly Professor Carlos de la Torre for inviting me, and Patricia Alba for making this possible. And it is an honor to share screen with such a great scholar as Cristobal Rovira. So it's a pleasure to be here. I want to start by explaining the main argument for constitutional change, or some of the arguments for constitutional change. And then I will try to address some of the issues regarding the recent outbursts that occurred in Chile a year ago, and some of the things that are happening right now after the referendum that took place on Sunday and its results. And so I'll try to give you a very general landscape before Cristobal enters with more specific topics, probably on what's going on in Chile. So our constitution is what Manuel Antonio Garretón calls an enclave. We had a transition to democracy that started really in 1988 with a referendum where there were two options, yes and no. Perhaps some of you have seen the movie No, which focuses mainly on the campaign, on the public campaign for the no. But aside from that publicitary campaign, there was a very strong social movement that led to the transition in 1988. We had many years of strong social protests in the 80s. and a very strong organization of political parties and coordination of the opposition to the dictatorship that managed to get together and force finally an electoral step that was considered originally in the constitution to be the election of Pinochet for 8 more years. And that was transformed by these political forces into really a referendum on the continuation or not of the dictatorship, on the continuity of the political regime, because the original structure, the original plan of the 1980 constitution was that in 1989 there would be a presidential election to basically choose a candidate selected by the military junta that had been ruling the country since the coup in 1973, and to extend its rule for 8 more years, and then have the transition to democracy 8 years later. This was because of the international pressure and because of the economic crisis and other and this political mobilization that I mentioned, that became the yes and no, el sí y el no referendum of 1988. And the beginning of the transition to democracy. At that time, many people claimed that we had a negotiated transition of the Spanish type. And so for many people, what occurred in 1988 onwards was a negotiation between political forces to produce a new democratic regime. But that interpretation became in time less and less credible, and has been challenged by a perspective that instead of seeing the transition as a negotiation among equal parties, sees it more as a transition to democracy that occur in the spaces that veto powers left free. So what happened in 1988 after the defeat of the dictatorship was the beginning of talks between the outgoing regime, the dictatorial authorities, and the incoming regime regarding constitutional change. The 1980 constitution, as it was framed originally, was never really put in place because it was approved in 1980 through a bogus referendum. It's very well documented that it was not a legitimate political consultation. And so after the 1980, what really what really regulated political life were the transitory articles of that constitution. The constitution, for instance, said that there was a Congress, and Congress was banned. There was not even a building for Congress. The constitution assumed the existence of political parties, but political parties in 1980 were forbidden. So there was what was written in the constitution was supposed to begin after the election of Pinochet in 1989, and that never happened. So the original constitution was never really put in practice. What was put in practice were the 29 transitory articles that were designed to maintain the dictatorship during the first years of the validation of this constitution through the 1980 referendum. And then, as I said, after the defeat of Pinochet in 1988 in this referendum, the opposition and the outgoing dictatorship negotiated 54 constitutional reforms that were also submitted to a new referendum in July 1989. So this referendum really was what validated the maintenance of this constitution. Without that referendum, without those changes, it would have really been impossible to call this a transition to democracy. You could not rule the country with the original 1980 constitution. It was too undemocratic, too openly contrary to basic rules of democracy. So what happened with these 54 reforms is that, for instance, political parties were legalized. There were some political parties that could not be legalized under the original constitution, like the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, which have been important parties in Chile's political system and in Chilean democracy historically. The 1989 reforms finished the exile, the norm of exile that was defended that existed in the constitution. And it changed the composition of the Senate. The Senate had a very large part of the Senate was composed of appointed senators, not elected. And so what happened in 1989 was that the number of senators increased. So they maintained the appointed senators, which at the time were 9. But because the elected senators increased, the proportion of appointed senators was lower. It was still enough to tilt majorities, no? And we had these appointed senators until 2005. We had army chiefs and armed forces chiefs that could not be removed by the president until 2005. So all of these norms and many others that remain in the 1980 Constitution were really the things that the outgoing authorities did not want to change. So what happened in 1989 was the approval of a set of reforms, which were what the political right and the heirs of the dictatorship were willing to change in order to maintain as much as possible of the old order. And the transition began with this, with a negotiated constitution that maintained a strong veto power in the political right. The political right assured its capacity to prevent political change through electoral rule called the binomial system, which is an extremely strange electoral rule where 2 senators or deputies or House representatives were elected in every district, and that forced the creation of 2 blocks, one center right, one center left, and in most districts, the result was 1 from each side was elected. In order to double the requirements to have 2 representatives from the same coalition were so high that it was almost impossible to attain. So this created a sort of freezing of the representation, because really the decision of who would be a senator or a deputy was made by the parties that decided on the candidates, not by electors, because it was known beforehand that 1 from each side was going to be elected, and this created a virtual tie in both chambers that made it very difficult to attain very strong majorities to produce political change. In addition to this binomial system, which I have to say was amended after 2005, when 2005, the norm that attached the electoral rule was removed from the Constitution in a very important constitutional reform in 2005, but it took still 10 more years to change the electoral rule. The political system, even though it did not have anymore the constitutional impediment to change the electoral rule, took until 2015 to change the binomial system. The binomial system was then, which is the electoral rule for Congress, was modified in 2015 and was used for the first time in 2017 in the parliamentary election of 2017, which elected this current Congress, and was replaced by a proportional system with a D'Hondt formula, and which also included a gender quota of 40% of candidates. And this meant that the Congress passed from having 15% of women to have 23% of women. So one of the enclaves, as Garreton calls them, of the tools, institutional tools that the dictatorship left in the political system to prevent change was the electoral system until this Congress. Another was, as I said before, a very important role for the military in politics, not only because armed chiefs were not removable by the president, and we had 2 instances where the president entered in conflict with the police head or the Navy chief, and the president could not remove him, but also through an institution called the National Security Council, which had very strong role in many political aspects in political life, appointing senators and with other political roles through the National Security Council, which also could summon the president and all the political institutions. The armed forces were also declared as the guardians of the institutional system. They were supposed to be the guardians of this model, no? So of this institutional setting. And that's why this project of that the 1980 Constitution implemented has been called a protected democracy with a tutelary role by the military. No? It was protected from the majorities, basically. It was protected from the democratic forces changing it. And Jaime Guzman, who was the jurist and the ideologue of, I don't know if you say ideologist, I don't know, the guy, the person with the ideas about this model, Jaime Guzman said in many instances and wrote it in articles that the purpose of this constitution was that if at some point their opponents happened to obtain power and to govern, they would be prevented by the constitution from doing anything very different than the military regime would themselves have done. So it was a constitution designed to prevent change. And this change prevention was done, as I said, through the electoral rule, through all these norms that I mentioned, the appointed senators, which distorted majorities also, but also through a very rigid amendment rule. The 1980 Constitution has quorums of 2/3 or 3/5 to amend itself, to amend the Constitution. So with all these other things on the side, it was impossible to get 2/3 to amend it. Beforehand, it was even more rigid. Before the 1989 reforms, you needed 2 consecutive Congresses to amend the Constitution. That was removed by the 1989 reform. But still, the rigidity remained very high, one of the highest, one of the most rigid constitutions in Latin America. And another mechanism for guaranteeing the mobility was that in addition to high quorums and to the electoral rule, the dictatorship incorporated any 18 matters as organic constitutional laws. So not only you had supramajoritarian things within the Constitution, but also outside the Constitution, there were 18 matters such as education, the central bank, political parties, the electoral system, and many others that required 4/7 of the vote to be amendment. So our Constitution, some people say we have a minimal Constitution, not at all, because you need to count as constitutional provisions all these constitutional organic laws that prevent political change through majorities. So it's a very anti-majoritarian system. And the school students discovered this when in 2006, they started a social movement to ask for changes in secondary education, in high school education in Chile. They began to demand that schools that obtain public funding do not select the students, do not choose their students. And they also asked that those schools do not profit, do not make financial profit from schools. And to make that happen legally, you needed 4/7 of the vote because it was an organic constitutional law. Education is an organic constitutional law. And so the students in 2006 clearly realized how this was also not only an educational problem or a social policy problem, but it was really a political problem, a political institutional problem. And I think what has been called the Penguin Revolt, because our high school students use uniforms that make them look like penguins, dark blue and navy blue and white. And so they're called penguins. The penguins, our high school students realized that there was a constitutional problem with the reform they wanted to do in education. And because that could not be done politically, they went out to the streets, they took over schools, and they began with that movement a cycle of social mobilization that didn't end until now, that started in 2006, became more active in 2011 with the university student movement, and then there was an explosion of social movements in many different areas, including a feminist movement in 2018, a strong movement against the pension system, movements for the environment and to stop energy projects that threaten the environment, movements for the recognition of indigenous groups, for sexual minorities, and many other social movements. So we went from a very static system in the 90s to, I can't believe I spoke so long, to a very, we went from a very static system in the 1990s to a very politicized citizen movement starting in 2005, which is in 2006, which funnily, or maybe not so funnily, coincides with the constitutional reform of 2005. It was right after the constitutional reforms that the people went to the streets to change politics, because they realized that voting did not allow for political change. So I think what we're seeing now is a result of 10 years of very intense social mobilization that ended in the October 18 outburst, which asked for, we don't know exactly what the people behind the outburst want, because it's a very massive movement, very numerous movement, without a clear identity, without leadership, without a petition, but with a strong claim for dignity, with a rejection of the economic model. The motto of the movement has been, it's not 30 pesos, it's 30 years. 30 pesos was the hike in the subway fare that initiated the protest, and a questioning of the economic model and of the vulnerability and lack of social protection. So I think that what happened in October was a clear conjunction of a demand for social protection, a rejection of neoliberalism by most Chileans, together with a rejection of the way politics has worked all these years, and a realization that our political model impedes social change. So the need, what is usually called the needs of people, the things that people want, education, healthcare, pensions, is related to the way political decisions are made, and the way our political system has really taken out majorities, has been strongly anti-majoritarian, has remained controlled by dictatorial rules, and has impeded political change. This movement was also coupled by a strong rejection of political parties and the political class, which makes it very hard to build a political response to it. And so we are dealing today with a very fragile process, I think, where the political system is trying to respond to these demands in the midst of people who don't want to know anything about political leaders and political parties or Congress. It's Congress really that has approved all the constitutional reforms that allow this process to take form, institutional form. The constitution-making process that we are facing now is regulated through a couple of constitutional reforms. The main reform is Law 21-200 that was approved in December, on Christmas, on December 24. And that set the steps for the process with the referendum we had on October 25, last Sunday, that gave a very clear mandate to change the constitution, with the election of constitution makers in April 11, and with exit referendum in the second half of 2022, when the constitution is ready. It will be submitted to a popular vote with mandatory voting, where people will be asked if they want the new constitution or if they want to go back to the 1980 constitution. So I'll leave it there, and then we can discuss more. I didn't have time to get to the causes of the outburst much, but we can take it back in the questions and the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Cristobal, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Carlos, for the invitation. Thank you very much, Patricia, also for organizing this event. And it's a pleasure to share the table virtually, at least with Claudia, who is a very esteemed colleague and who is the expert on this topic. So I'm not really an expert in constitutional change. So I will try to add something to the presentation that Claudia has already done. Let me share my screen because I do have a PowerPoint that will help me to organize my presentation, but also because I will present a couple of ideas and data. So in the next 25 minutes, I want to offer a sort of overview to try to understand the process of constitutional change. I think that Claudia gave us a lot of very good insights about what is the problem with the constitutions, the whole issue about the origins of the constitution, and also the legitimacy challenge behind the constitution, as well as the problem that it really difficults social change. And I want to make a bit broader perspective to try to understand why is it that we are discussing at the moment the constitutional change, and also probably I will try to explain or depict a couple of scenarios that will probably happen in the near future. So my presentation is divided in 4 hopefully short points. First, I will say something about the issue that we have a right-wing government that came to power in 2017. And this is a bit of a paradox, as I will explain, because we have a society that's getting more and more and more liberal and more social democratic, but it ends up electing a right-wing government. This is a sort of a paradox, and I want to point out. And secondly, I will talk about the social outbreak, something that Claudia already mentioned, and this is the key issue to understand why is it that at the end of the day, the right decided to open up the possibility of undertaking a process of constitutional change. Third, I will talk briefly about the result of the constitutional referendum. I have a couple of graphs showing the data that Claudia already mentioned, that it's a massive support for the constitutional change. And if I have time, I will say a couple of ideas about what will happen in the coming months and years, although I think that we are very bad about doing predictions, but I will try to play a bit the different scenarios I think that might happen in the near future. So let's go to the first point, and this is the issue that the right comes to power. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I think this is a sort of a paradox, because we already know that Chilean society has been gradually becoming more liberal. I will use the US-American concept, or if you use the European or Latin American concept, you will say it's getting more leftist. And this is important in both cultural dimension and the economic dimension. I don't want to bother you and present thousands of graphs, but I will present a couple of them just to support this idea that Chilean society in the last 2 to 3 decades since the transition to democracy in the early 90s has been gradually becoming more liberal or leftist. So first of all, if you take data on moral issues, so this is the classical question from World Value Survey that asks to what extent people believe that it's justifiable to have abortion, divorce, or homosexuality. And as you can see in all these questions, you have a trend going up, which means that Chilean society is getting more and more liberal. If I would present the same data in a comparative perspective with other Latin American countries, it is fascinating, because Chile at the beginning of the 90s was probably one of the more conservative societies within Latin America, if not the most one. And if you compare contemporary Chile to the rest of Latin America, it's quite a liberal society. And this is a gradual process of change, didn't occur from one day to another. It took 20 to 30 to 40 years. But this is part of the process that it's important to keep in mind. So this is another piece of evidence. This comes from the Latin American Public Opinion Project. This is a typical question that asks whether people are in favor of not of a same-sex marriage, and it's a scale that grows from 0 to 10, and it's the same trend that you see before. So slowly, Chilean society is getting more liberal and is in favor of gay marriage. And let me move now to the economic dimension, the other aspect that I think it's important to keep in mind. As I mentioned at the beginning, Chilean society is getting more leftist of liberal. This is, again, a typical question from Latinobarometro, which asks whether the privatization of public enterprises has been beneficial for the country. And as you can see, the gray line goes up. So there is more and more people that think that at the end of the day, this was not the best way ahead for the country. I think this graph is quite important because there are 2 ways in which you can read the graph. One way of reading the graph, which is, I think it's a wrong one, is to say, oh, Chileans do want to have the Cuban model or North Korea or have Venezuela or something like that. And I think this is completely wrong. Chileans are not necessarily against the free market, but they're upset to a society that is way too neoliberal. And the next graph, in fact, supports the argument that I'm developing. This is a typical question, again, from Latinobarometro, that's asked whether the market economy is the only system through which the country can become developed. And as you can see, a majority of Chileans do think that the free economics, at the end of the day, is the best model to have economic development. But as we know, having a free market, there are many different versions of that. Sweden has a free market, Germany has a free market, but at the same time, it has a welfare state. And this is the key issue. What Chileans are demanding is the gradual process of construction of social universal rights, similar to social democratic countries in Western Europe. So, and finally, this is another piece of evidence that it's important. This comes from a report from UNDP. This was a survey that they have done in several years that puts the following question, that this is the percentage of the Chilean population that disagrees, I marked that in red, with the idea that it's fair that those who can pay more should have access to better health, education for their children. And as you can see over time, more and more Chileans disagrees with that idea, which is again a support for the argument that I was saying before. Chileans don't want to implement North Korea. What Chileans want to have is a sort of social democratic models in which it doesn't matter if you are rich or poor, but you should have access to good education and to a good health system. And I think this is key to understand the demands behind the social outbreak that I will speak about that in a couple of minutes. So how can we explain that Chilean society has been gradually becoming more liberal of leftists? And to make a long story very short, I think that this process can be explained by two factors. Of course, there are many others, but I think two are the main factors that help us to understand that. The first, it's a classical modernization argument, modernization theory argument. Chile, in comparative perspective, has experienced a very rapid process of economic modernization. And this is, in fact, what the political elite and the economic elite all normally tells to the people both within Chile and outside. And they say Chile is a sort of role model that to a certain extent is true, because if you see economic growth have been impressive, poverty has been going down, although the levels of inequality are relatively stable. It is true that the Gini coefficient went a bit down, but it's not a major issue. What it's important to keep in mind is that this process of rapid economic modernization had as a consequence what Ronald Ingersoll calls the silent revolution, which means a cultural transformation within society. And this is the best way to understand why is it that Chileans are getting more liberal in cultural terms. Chilean society is getting much more educated than before. They're much more open-minded than they were at the beginning of the 90s. And because of that, they do want to see social changes in both in the cultural realm and in the economic realm. But there is a second aspect that is crucial, and this is something that Claudia already mentioned in her presentation, and this has to do with the fact that we have seen the rise of very different social movements that have been able to repoliticize inequalities. And this is something crucial because the repoliticization of inequalities has not been done by the political parties. It has been done outside of the political parties, mainly by the different social movements that Chile has been seeing in the last few years. The most important one, of course, is the student movement that Claudia already mentioned, started with the Pingüinos in the 2006, but then in 2011 with the huge tertiary education movement. Then we have also the feminist movement that has been very relevant in the last few years. And we also have the so-called No Más AFP movement, which is a big social movement against the current pension system that we have, that it's a fully privatized pension system. So let me then finish this first part of presentation with the paradox. So if Chilean society has been gradually becoming more liberal and leftist in both cultural and economic terms, how can we explain that the right was able to win the 2017 presidential election? This is a sort of a paradox. And there are a couple of pieces of, there are a couple of arguments that help us to understand that. The first one is that the left currently is extremely divided in very different factions. This has to do with internal battles within the so-called Concertación or Nueva Mayoría, but also the emergence of a new left-wing bloc, which is called the Frente Amplio. It's different than in Spain, but you can see this is a sort of Podemos that competes against the PSOE, if you want, a bit like that, and then you have the fragmentation of the left in these different actors. The second aspect that it's important to mention is that the right, in contrast to the left, so far, because I will go back to this, has been able to stay together. And this is crucial to understand why they have been so successful in the presidential election. And the third aspect is turnout. Turnout in Chile for presidential elections is extremely low. And as you can see in the graph, it's a tendency that's been going down in the last few years. And if you see the last point that I present there, the second round for the presidential elections, less than 50% of Chileans participated, roughly 50%, 49 point something participated in the election. And this is quite important because this means that Piñera, it's true that won the 2017 election, but he didn't obtain a huge majority if you think about the whole picture. In fact, he was able to mobilize roughly 25% of the electorate. And I think this is important to thinking about the social outbreak, which I will mention now in a couple of seconds. So let's go now to the second part of my presentation, and this is the social outbreak. I remember when Piñera won the election at the end of 2017, I wrote a short piece for Foreign Affairs that, as you can see there, the title is A Bitter Victory for the Chilean Right. And the subtitle that I put there is Why Sebastián Piñera Will Struggle to Govern. And the main idea that I developed here in that very short piece is that Piñera made a huge mistake. And the mistake is that he was able to win the presidential election by a very short margin. Remember that he obtained at the end of the day 25% of the electorate, no more than that. But he thought, not only him, but also the people working behind him, that he had a huge majority behind him for continuing with the same sort of policies that the right have been trying to implement in the last few years. On the top of that, and here comes the issue of the division of the right, it appears a new right during the government of Piñera. The person that you can see there is Jos Antonio Cass. He is an old member of UDI. So UDI is the very right-wing party that it's, to a certain extent, the party that comes from the military dictatorship. And Jos Antonio Cass decided to went out of the party to run as an own presidential candidate for the 2017 election, and he got roughly 10% of the electorate. And during the government of Piñera, he built a new political party, which is called Acción Republicana. You can see the figure. If you are familiar with West European politics, you will see that the figure of Acción Republicana, the logo, is exactly the same than the logo of the Front National in France. And this is not a coincidence because Jos Antonio Cass is a populist radical right candidate with a very harsh radical discourse, not so far away from the discourse of Bolsonaro, Trump, and other guys like that. In fact, here you have a picture of Jos Antonio Cass with Bolsonaro. And I have there a quote that I think Carlos, who likes to study populism, will love that quote. As you can see, Jos Antonio Cass claimed that he says, we are the voice of that silent majority, which is often silenced by ideological groups. Most journalists are from the left and the media are dominated by their opinions, editorials, and reports. As you can see, he has this very aggressive language attacking the mainstream, so to say they're colonizing the space and the right is not able to govern in a proper way. And I think that the emergence of Jos Antonio Cass represents a big problem for Sebastián Piñera because he tries to stay together all these different right-wing groups. And some of these groups are pushing for moderation and the other groups are pushing for radicalization. And this is the case of Jos Antonio Cass. And during the first years of his government, in fact, my impression is he opted much more to try to pacify those who are on the radical right-wing bloc instead of trying to pursuing moderate reforms with the more centrist bloc. And one of the consequences of that had been the social outbreak that Claudia already mentioned at the beginning. So everything started, as Claudia said, with this issue of the 30 pesos. So we have the issue that in October 2019, so 19, we have the price of the metro goes up by 30 pesos, and then students start to demonstrate, and then this starts to scale up. The demonstration goes really, really fast and big. And I think this is, of course, my pure interpretation, but I think at the beginning of the outbreak, the first days, Piñera had two options, either to move to the center and try to say, I understood what is going on in Chilean society, and I will go for undertaking broad social reforms, or he had the option to stay with the right-wing bloc, the radical bloc, and say, this is just rubbish, and we will use hard measures. And this is, in fact, the way that Piñera went, and I think that generated even more outrage within society. These pictures are probably well known for most of you, but the picture there is Piñera the day of the outbreak. He goes to one of the poshest neighborhoods in Santiago to eat a pizza when the country is literally burning, which again is an image of someone who is completely detached from social reality. Then the day after, he gives this famous speech in which he says that we are at war, which means that we are at war with our own citizens. So it sounds almost like the military junta, although funnily enough, Piñera comes much more from this liberal right, not from the radical right bloc. But the problem is, again, that this radical right bloc is pushing into certain direction. And I think that they completely misunderstood and misread what was going on in Chilean society. And because of that, a couple of days later, you have this massive demonstration across Chilean society. So the numbers are still difficult to figure, but everybody agrees that at least in Santiago, we have more than 1 million people protesting. And if you add up people protesting all over Chile, this is by far the biggest social demonstration that we have had in Chile since the transition to democracy in the early 1990s. And on the top of that, one of the very crude realities is that the police and the military was very, very harsh in reacting to that and generate a lot of tensions within Chilean society and human rights abuses that are very well documented by different international organizations at this stage. So what's one of the outcomes of that, and this is something that Claudia already mentioned, is that after a while, Piñera realized very reluctantly that the only way out of the social conflict was to moderate. And it was not a possibility to continue with the military killing people on the streets. And the way out was the so-called Agreement for Social Peace and a New Constitution, which was signed up on November 15. You can see here the pictures of the most leaders of the Congress that were bargaining for a couple of days. And they signed up this contract that this agreement that had three main ideas that I put there. The first one is a so-called Referendum de Entrada. So that's a referendum that we have a couple of days ago, in which the people have the right to decide whether we want to have a new constitution or not. Then secondly, this agreement states that in the case that Chileans are in favor of changing the constitution, there will be a process of constitutional drafting that it will last for between 9 to 12 months. And finally, there will be a so-called exit referendum or referendum de salida, as we say in Spanish, in which people will have the right to vote to say whether they want to have the new constitution or whether they want to keep the old model. And we cannot understand, I think this is again crucial, that the right was able to undertake that sort of process only because of the pressure from the streets, and only because the right started to realize that they have these two different souls, so to say, within the right, and it was time to moderate rather than to hear the radical version of the right. So this is how we end up with what I think most people want to hear about, and this is a constitutional referendum. Something important that I didn't mention before is that originally the referendum should take place at the end of April of 2020, but because of the pandemic, the Senate decided to postpone those for a couple of months, and this is why we ended up having the constitutional referendum last week. And as you can see here, in the constitutional referendums, we had the possibility to answer two very simple questions. The first question is whether we want to have a new constitution, and this was the apruebo, those who were in favor of that, and the rechazo, those who were against that. And the second question, or that was the second ballot, is which type of entity should write this new constitution, and we had two options: whether this should be a sort of constituent assembly that will work only for that purpose, or whether we'll have a sort of mixed constituent assembly in which we'll have people elected for that, and at the same time, people from Congress working together to trying to draft this new constitution. So the result, something that Claudia already mentioned, was massive. And to be completely honest, I think that nobody expected that it's going to be that massive. I mean, most people thought that the approval will win, but the margin is just amazing. As you can see here, almost 80% of Chileans decided that they want to have a new constitution, and almost 80% of Chileans decided that the new constitution should be written by this constitutional convention, so a sort of constituent assembly. But what is also interesting about that, and there is this map that has been in the last few days, I think, but almost every Chilean have seen this map either in the news or via WhatsApp or via Facebook, whatever. So this is a map of Santiago, and you can see the red color are those neighborhoods in which people voted against the constitutional referendum, and all the green colors are those neighborhoods in which people voted in favor of that. And what this graph is telling us, I think it's something crucial that it's very important to keep in mind for the future of the process, is that Chilean society is not really polarized about the relevance of changing the constitution. At the end of the day, 80% of Chileans say that's what we want. Of course, this doesn't mean that all Chileans want to have the same constitutional model. And in fact, we'll have a lot of discussion about which type of country we want to build and which type of constitution, but most Chileans think that it's time to change the constitution. But the second aspect that it's important to mention that the graph is telling us is that there is a minority of people that is against that. And the minority of people that are against the constitutional change, it's very clear where they live and where do they come from. And this is a wealthy elite. In fact, these three neighborhoods are the three richest neighborhoods within Santiago, which means that those who have a lot of economic power, which normally translates into political power, are against the constitutional process. And I think this is quite problematic for the next steps that we will see in the couple of months and probably years. So finally, before I go to the conclusion, which are the next steps, something that Claudia already mentioned, we'll have in the beginning of April 2021, the elections for the member of the Constitutional Convention. So at the end of the year, we'll have presidential and parliamentary elections. And if then there is no clear majority, we'll have a ballotage election in December 2021. And no later than August 2022, we'll have the exit referendum. And I think what is important is that this exit referendum has a mandatory voting. And my impression that this is quite important because we know from political science that once there is mandatory voting, the impact of clause voting is much more relevant because we know that the poor is going to vote. So the rich normally vote. This is all over the places in the world. This is not only a Chilean phenomenon, but if you have mandatory voting, this means poor people will vote, and this probably it's something good for the legitimacy of the constitutional process. So I'm running out of time. Let me now go to the concluding remarks that will probably help us to open up a bit the discussion also with what the people are hearing us, but also I would love to hear what Claudia thinks about my ideas that I have about the future with all the difficulties about doing predictions. So the first aspect that I think it's very crucial is something that I mentioned before, and this is this nice map that I presented about Santiago, is that the result of the referendum reveals something that most of us knew within Chile, but it's just quite evident now that the elite, a big chunk of the elite, not everybody, but I think a big chunk of the economic elite and political elite lives in a bubble within this country. And they have serious problems to try to comprehend what is going on within Chilean society. My hope, I'm not sure about that, my hope is that the elite it's going to divide now between hardliners and softliners, to use the language of Guillermo O'Donnell. So the hardliners will continue to push to avoid any type of reform, but the softliners will understand that the only way out to generate social legitimacy and to have social peace is to adapt to the new scenario. And I hope that this will be the outcome because this will facilitate that we'll have a constituent process that can work in a good way. If this doesn't happen and the elite continues to block the reforms, this will generate a lot of social tension. Now let's talk about the left. And I think this is important because we'll have elections, as I mentioned before, in April for the Constituent Assembly. So, and it's still a very open question whether the left will be able to join forces for the Constituent Assembly. And if they're not able to do that, this is a very bad news for them because this will mean that we'll have like a ballot box in which we'll have a lot of different options. And this, of course, will deteriorate the capacity of the left to get a lot of seats within the Constituent Assembly. But even in the case that the left is able to win, let's imagine for a second they're able to join forces. I think that the Chilean constitution process will be very different from the so-called Bolivarian experiences. And we have Carlos here, who is an expert about that. We can talk more about this in the Q&A, but I think there are a couple of reasons why we shouldn't be scared about the constitutional process that will follow the same path than Venezuela, for example. I think that the social and political conditions in Chile are quite different. And this is why I don't fear that sort of problem in the Chilean context. Third point that I want to mention is that it's very clear that, as I have said during my presentation, that the right is experiencing this growing tension between moderation on the one hand, those who are in fact saying we need to change the constitution. And in fact, there are a couple of actors within the right who are saying we want to have a sort of social democratic model like in Germany, for example. So we love, for example, Christian democracy in Germany, which for Chilean standards is a very leftist project, but some right-wingers now understood that this is the only way ahead. But you also have Jos Antonio Cass that I mentioned before, that they say our way ahead is Bolsonaro and Trump and etc. So for me, the key question is whether they will be able to stay united or not. And this is a big question. And I don't have a clear answer yet. I think it will depend a lot of what will happen in the next few months and also about the negotiations for building a list for the Constituent Assembly. But I think this is a crucial question that will have long-term consequences for Chile. And finally, and this is my positive note on that, I think that the whole process of constitutional change, it's very unclear. I mean, there are a lot of things that are going to happen. As I mentioned before, we have the election for the Constituent Assembly. We're going to have we're going to have presidential and parliamentary elections, and we'll have the exit referendum. But despite all the uncertainty, my feeling is that there are good reasons why we should be confident that Chile will slowly and gradually, and this is important, it will be no from one day to another, but I see gradually will be moved towards something more social democratic. We will not become Sweden, forget about that, but we will slowly become a bit more social democratic and less neoliberal. And this in part has to do with the process of constitutional change. And that's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cristobal. So why don't we start with some comments of Claudia to what you just said, and then you can respond to Claudia, and then we can get some questions from the audience. So Claudia, the floor is yours.
Well, I tend to agree with Rovira, with Cristobal's presentation and his conclusions. I am optimistic with regard to the overall results of the process. I also think it's different from the Bolivarian experience, particularly because it's an extremely institutionalized process. This process started with an agreement from a plurality of political parties that go from the extreme right to the almost extreme left. The Communist Party did not want to join the agreement. The Communist Party has been ambivalent. They don't want to look negotiating with the right, because many people perceive the agreement as a betrayal of the social movement. Particularly, I think there's a very strong group in the left of very disaffected people who don't believe that any political solution can be reached, and that any kind of agreed exit to the crisis will mean a betrayal of the ideals of the mobilization. So I think the communists don't want to pay that cost. Some groups in the Frente Amplio, in this heterogeneous new left, also didn't want to appear negotiated with the right. But my sense is that group that does not believe in a negotiated political exit to the crisis is a minority. And most people in Chile do believe I hesitate to say that they do believe in politics, because there's a very strong rejection of politics. But I think that most Chileans are pragmatic and understand that the options are revolution, a bloody revolution, or some kind of institutionalized exit as the one the political parties are building. And I'm sure that most people don't want the confrontational exit. So the left really pays a cost with its basis to join these negotiations. But I think, as I said, I'm optimistic that this road will prevail, and that it is a pluralistic process. It's strongly regulated. The constitutional reform that I mentioned that regulated most of the steps in the process is Law 21-200, and it has a clause called Special Regulations of the Process that limits the Constitutional Convention. It explicitly says that the convention cannot overtake other powers, cannot take executive power or legislative or anything. It can only do the Constitution, cannot do anything else but write a Constitution. It cannot change the character of republic of the state or the democratic system. It cannot ignore international treaties or judicial decisions that are already taken. And so it's a limited and institutionalized setting that I think all political forces respect. So in that sense, it's in between really a radical break with the past and an institutionalized legal process within the rules, because it's what happened in December was really that the political system took this unchangeable constitution and made a hole within it. So from the same constitution, all these rules are now in the constitution. It is the 1980 constitution now with these reforms that says there will be a constitution making process and it will happen this and that way. So I think that's a very good sign that the political system is still alive, even though there are all these problems. In another point that Cristobal mentioned, the problems of the left to build agreements, I'm not so optimistic. I think the divide between the ex-concertación and the traditional center-left and the new left is very strong. And I think for the new left, it's very costly to appear like they are the same as the old center-left that is seen as having betrayed the project of building a less unequal country and changing the model. So I'm not very optimistic that they will be able to build the election list that they need to win more representatives. And of course, that will be damaging to the representativeness of the constitution-making body, because the right will capitalize from this fragmentation of the left. And you also have to add that the independents will also compete with the center-left. There are independent groups that are center-left groups that are seen as non-political, non-related to parties, but that will appeal to the same electorate. So the right will go together united and the left will be divided, at least between the traditional center-left, the new left, and the civil society. And I don't see how that can be resolved.
Thank you, Cristobal.
Yes, I mean, just to add to what Claudia was saying, and this goes back to probably the issue of the difference between the constitutional process that is happening in Chile and the constitutional process that happened under the so-called Bolivarian countries. I think there are a couple of very different factors at play here in Chile and why this process is going to be different. And this is why I'm not afraid about the democratic outcome, because we know that in Venezuela, we had this constitutional change that one of the consequences, it was not only because of the constitution, to be fair enough, but we know that the process at the end of the day ended up deteriorating democracy in Venezuela, and the same happened in other countries. And I think that Chile is different. The first issue is something that Claudia already mentioned. I think the possibility that the left stays together and build only one list, it's very, very limited. But even in the case that that happened, that I'm also very skeptical about that, even in the case that that happened, I don't think that they will have enough pressure for doing something like a sort of revolutionary constitution like the Bolivarian mold. And the reason for that is twofold, I would say. First, in the case of Venezuela, but also in other countries, the process of constitutional change was made during the commodity boom. And this means those who were in power, Chavez, had huge revenues that was very helpful for him for winning the elections. And what we have now in Chile is an economic situation that it's not dramatic, but we are far beyond the so-called economic boom. I mean, we're having economic growth, forget about COVID, that makes everything more difficult. But even at the beginning of Piñera, that everybody thought, okay, he's going to generate economic growth, and he was able to generate 2-3%, no more than that. So the economic situation is quite different. And the second one, that I think it's even more relevant than the economic dimension, is something that Claudia mentioned in brief there, and this has to do with that behind the social movement, there is no clear leadership. And this makes the picture in Chile completely different from the case of Venezuela or in Ecuador. Because even in Chile, you will have one leader that goes to Plaza Italia, which is the main square where people protest, and they will say, I claim that I'm the leader of the movement. I think everybody will look at that guy and say, who elected you? I mean, this movement is completely headless, so to say. And it's very challenging, but one of the advantages of that is that there is no possibility that you will have like this political outsider that will say, I'm the one who is representing the people in singular, because the people is not singular, it's very plural in Chile. And this is why they're saying there's no possibility that one person is going to represent us. So, and this is why I do think that the whole process of constitutional change is going to be quite different. And again, what I mentioned in the presentation briefly at the end, for me, the key issue is what the hell is going to happen with the right. Because it's very clear that the right is getting more and more divided. But so far, the Chilean right has been able to stay together with these different factions. But now my feeling is they are feeling the tensions about that. Just to, if you remember the graph that I presented, so after the day of the election, because the results were very fast, So there was this interview in which the journalist was talking to Jacqueline Van Rysselberghe, who is the president of the UDI, the very right-wing party. And the journalist asked, so what do you think about the result of the electoral referendum? And she says, oh, this is great, because we are going to be the party of the 20%, so the 20% of the richest population. But of course, there are many people within the right who are saying this is complete nonsense. Because if we go that way ahead, we are going to be a minority government, a minority party without any chances of governing. So there are big chances within the right. They're saying, forget about that. We need to try to keep this 20% within us, but we need to move much more to the center in order to build a sort of broader coalitions, because otherwise there is no way in which the right can be able to govern in the next 10 to 20 to 30 years. And I think this is, for me, a crucial aspect, that it's still unfolding and it's unclear how the right at the end of the day is going to react.
Well, thank you. This has been fascinating. Let me ask you a question just to clarify. So when Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador went to have this constituent process to change the constitution, to change the economic model of society, to change the way in which nature and human beings relate to each other, right? First of all, these were demands that came from a myriad of social movements. In the case of Ecuador and Bolivia, it was the indigenous movement. In the case of Venezuela, you have the left asking for a constituency process. But the problem there was that, as you were saying, there were leaders behind these processes that at the end were the ones who sort of limited some of what the Constituency Assembly was going to do. And that's not something that exists in Chile. In Chile, you have an horizontal movement of change where you have more radical, you can correct me if I am saying things that do not make sense. You have an horizontal movement demanding change, and where you have a lot of different proposals. So, and it's highly unlikely, both of you say, that there will be a leader that will become the embodiment of all of these demands of change in Chile. Second of all, and I'm very interested about this, is the whole institutionalization of the Constituency Assembly. As Claudia was saying, the different political parties, but not all, agreed to put limits on what the Constitutional Convention can do. But remember that in the case of Ecuador, for instance, there were certain agreements that existed there. The agreement was that the Constituency Assembly was only going to change the constitution. But when they possess themselves, they say that they are going to change everything. That they are the embodiment of the people, and that they are the most democratic organization, and therefore that they can change the constitution in every way. So first of all, they assume total powers, and then they sent Congress into a recess, meaning into vacation, and the Congress was elected not too long ago, and then they recognized the power of President Correa. So, I mean, yes, Chile has a different political culture. Yes, Chileans go much more in terms of recognizing processes, but you also have very radical sectors in the social movement that was asking for this Constituency Assembly. So that's the first one. The second one is, how are Chileans going to learn from the mistakes of the Bolivarian revolutions? The Bolivarian constitutions expanded rights. I mean, they even gave rights to nature. They gave rights to indigenous people. They expanded all types of rights within the limits that they can negotiate. But at the same time, they concentrated power in the executive, because the idea was to stay in power until finishing a revolution. So what are the lessons that Chileans would have learned from the mistakes, I will say, of these constituent assemblies? And finally, and this is more to what Cristobal was saying, I mean, you showed that Chilean society since the 1990s had become much more liberal, leftist, social democratic. But remember that in the 1970s, you have a very radicalized Chile in which at least 30% of the population, perhaps more, were trying to experiment with a socialist transformation of society by using democracy. So, I mean, this progressive liberalization of Chilean society, how does it play in the long durée? I mean, you have a very radical, I mean, you have the first democratic attempt to change capitalism by democratic means. Then you have the radicalization of everybody. Perhaps I'm sounding too institutional today. And then you have a coup d'etat, and then you have Chileans learning to value institutions. But in a way, Chileans were much more leftist before than what they are now, or perhaps not, I don't know. So just to provoke some conversation at this point. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Claudia, do you want to go first?
Okay, I'll start. Just very briefly, I think with regard to the limits of the convention, there is some debate right now because the agreement, the original agreement of November 15, before the regulation of the constitutional reform, said that the election of the members of the convention will be done following the rules of the voting laws for the Chamber of the Deputies, regulated by the law 18700, which is a regular proportional system to elect the Chamber of the Deputies. And the Chamber of the Deputies has 155 members. So the convention was supposed to be composed, not the mixed one that had another regime, but the one that was elected was supposed to have 155 members elected in the same districts where you elect deputies normally. But together with that agreement, there was always a promise that was not in the agreement that there would be an additional agreement, what we call the acuerdo complementario, that was said from the day one, that in addition to this rule of the Chamber of the Deputies, it was necessary to make some amendments to that rule to make it more inclusive and to have special provisions for gender, at least gender quotas. In the beginning, nobody talked about parity, which was the result, surprising, I think, for everyone, and probably related to the feminist movement of 2018. But gender, independence, and indigenous groups always were said to need special representation in the convention. And so this was what we call the acuerdo complementario, the additional agreement, that the parties could not agree on for the reform of December. When we entered this commission to write the reform, all of us thought that we were going to regulate those three aspects and to write in the reform that the electoral system will have some particularities to include in a more, to include more these three categories, independence, women, and indigenous. The parties did not reach an agreement, but what the solution we saw in December was to prevent limitations for future change. The UDI in the beginning wanted in the commission that proposed this bill to have a specific norm that said that the electoral rule would apply as it stands by December 2019. So they wanted to freeze it in December, so Congress could not change it afterwards. And there was, as Cristobal mentioned, there was a division within the right, because except for the most extreme right, Evópoli and Renovación Nacional, the other main groups in the right, understood that they had to do some changes, that people would not be happy to elect a constitution as a constitutional convention with these exact rules that are seen as so exclusionary and so elitist. Then the Evópoli moved further right, but at that point they were actually, it was at that point that the UDI pressured Evópoli, I think, to move further right. But so what happened is that what we managed to do in that commission was to prevent that norm from freezing the electoral rule, and it was frozen, but to a later date. So the rule says that the electoral rules will apply as they stand at July 2020 instead of December 2019. So we managed to move the date so Congress could keep working after this reform to try to continue negotiating and reach an agreement. And that happened in March. In March, there was a rule for independence and for women, and we still don't have a rule for indigenous groups. And I wanted to talk about that, what you said about the limits of the convention and how the assembly declared some of these other cases. They said we are the sovereign and we can do whatever we want. some people in the right now are claiming that the change that are being negotiated now about the indigenous seats, reserved seats for indigenous groups, break the agreement. So there's a debate now as to whether this breaks the agreement or fulfills the agreement. So they say, we said 155 and we cannot move further up. And the others say, we always knew that we had to do something special for the indigenous groups which have been excluded from this process, and which are a very important motive behind the revolt, because when you saw the people on the streets, the only flag you could see was the Mapuche flag. There were no political party flags. There were some soccer team flags, but the only flags that were allowed in the protests were soccer team flags and Mapuche flags. So I think this is very much something that is asking for recognition and for inclusion of groups that have been excluded. And I think there's a debate about that now. And one last point about that, I don't think there's any chance that this will take total power, because it's basically controlled by political parties. The people that are going to be selected for the constitutional convention will mostly be appointed by parties, because the basic rule for electing deputies is made for political parties and to prevent independents and other groups. Now they're trying to include independents with some special rules, but the independents will mostly have to go within party lists or have separate lists, and it's very complicated, but it will still be mostly controlled by parties. So I think the pluralism in the convention is guaranteed also by that. And about what you said about learning from mistakes, I think there are particularly intellectual debates about this Gargarella hypothesis of the engine room of the Constitution, and how many countries granted many rights but did not deconcentrate power. No, so at the same time, they turned the organic and the dogmatic parts of the Constitution against each other. There is debate about that, and I think there is, at least in the center left, a push to diffuse power, so to decentralize, to reduce hyper-presidentialism and empower Congress, to create some direct democracy mechanisms. And there is also a certain level of conscience that rights can be, as Rosalind Dixon has written, ¿cómo se dice? Soborno.
Bribes?
Bribes. You can have the rights bribe. So they give you rights in exchange for maintaining the structure of power. And I think there is now debate as to how do you really change the structure of power. And of course, that's the key issue in the constitution making process, and the right will try to maintain the structure of power as much as possible. And I think that's the basic danger of the process, because if there is no redistribution of power in the end of the process, then I think the process has a really serious possibility of failing to interpret what the social movement that made it appear in the first place.
Thank you, Cristobal.
Yes, I mean, let me try to answer the three comments that you, Carlos, posed. The first one is about how the social movement is composed and to what extent that makes the difference probably with other experiences within Latin America. And I think that the argument that you were developing, I would say it's very clear, and I would agree with you, in the sense that the social movement, it's extremely heterogeneous in Chile. I mean, Claudia was already mentioned there. If I will go to protest with the flag of a country, people will kill me. I mean, they don't want to see parties. It's very against parties, but it's very unclear about what in favor, what they really want. You will have like people say, we want like have better education, better health, we're in favor of gender issues. It's extremely heterogeneous. And this is why it's very difficult that you will have the leader in singular that will pop up and I will say, I'm able to interpret in the right way all these different demands. I mean, to use the jargon of Laclau, I would say it's extremely impossible to build a chain of equivalence and to try to fill the empty signifier, so to say. And this is why I think there is a democratic hope in the whole process, because using the language of Lefort, I mean, democracy is still empty, so to say. It's impossible that someone will come and they say, well, I'm the one who is going to do the right interpretation, because there is no right interpretation. People are struggling about that, even within the movement, because some people want this and some people want that, etc. And this, of course, makes the whole movement more challenging, but probably makes the whole outcome probably more democratic. That's at least my hope. The second aspect is you were asking about how to learn from the mistakes from other experiences within Latin America. And I think there are a couple of reasons why I'm a bit more confident. And probably this learning process, I'm not sure if it's really conscious, so to say, or it has rather to do with how the process unfolded in Chile. This is pure interpretation. I don't have any way of proving what I'm going to say. But my feeling is that the process was possible, as I was saying before, because you had this tension within the right-wing bloc between the hardliners and the softliners. And the softliners, again, this is pure interpretation, the softliners were able to convince the hardliner because they were saying, if we don't open up now the constitutional process, this will happen in the next election. And in the next election, if we continue in power in the same way, we are going to be killed. So, and the left is going to get a huge majority, and then we'll have the Venezuelan model. But if we open up now the constitutional process, we are still controlling power, which means we have a power to bargain about how this constitutional process is going to be unfold, so to say. This is my interpretation. I cannot prove it, but this is my feeling of why these hardcore believers said, okay, let's go into that way. Although they were extremely against that, they understood from a right choice perspective that it was better to open up the opportunity because they still have some room of maneuver. But this makes, again, the process more complicated because the left cannot do whatever they want because the right is still in government. We have Sebastián Piñera y La Moneda. I mean, they don't have a majority in Congress, but they still have a lot of power. The second aspect is what Claudia was saying. The process is going to be controlled by parties. I think civil society will play a role, but it's going to be a minor role. And what probably will happen is that political parties will try to appoint in their own list some people from civil society. They're very famous. So if you have a very famous public intellectual, for example, from the left and goes within a list of the left, you will win probably. Or it might be that some of them, but you need to be very famous. I mean, probably if I will run, I will get 5 votes. But if you're extremely famous public intellectual, you might have an attraction for winning a seat without the support of a party. But these are very few people that are going to get that. So I think at the end of the day, the Constituent Assembly is going to have a lot of very well-known politicians, or not that well-known, but people that come from political parties. And the third aspect, what I think that the Constituent Assembly is going to be different in Chile, and we learn from the mistakes, it has to do with this 2/3 rule. So correct me if I'm wrong, Claudia, because you know that much better than me, and there has been a debate about that, but whatever will be approved in the Constitutional Assembly, it has to be approved by 2/3. And I think this is crucial because the Constituent Assembly, I think there is no way in which you will have either a hardcore right-wing bloc or a hardcore left-wing bloc getting more than 1/3. If everything goes well, they will get 20 to 25%, which means whenever you want to draft something into the Constitution, you need to bargain. So the right-wing bloc will say, we want to have the free market entrenched, probably even better than before. They will not have 2/3 for that. At the very leftists, they will say, we want to have North Korea, and they will not have 2/3 for that, which probably means that at the end of the day, we might end up having a very lean constitution, a very small constitution, which means that probably it will not say that we'll have like the welfare state like in Sweden, but it will not say that we'll have the free market like in the United States, which means that the next governments, depending on the majorities that they have, will probably try to implement reforms into one direction or into another. But because Chilean society, as I argued at the beginning of my presentation, it's getting more liberal and more leftist, whatever will happen in the next future, it's going to be into that sort of social democratic mold. But I think it's going to be gradual and it will take a lot of time. And finally, about the third question that they were doing, Carlos, about the more longue durée perspective. I think you are right and you are wrong. I mean, right in the sense that, of course, it sounds to a certain extent like a deja vu, because we have, again, like pressure from below, people demanding social change against the right, etc. So in this sense, there has some similarities, and you have this very, very strong social movement. And it seems that we have a lot of polarization, similar than in the 70s. But there are a big difference. First is this issue of polarization that I mentioned at the beginning. I think Chilean society is not that polarized. If you look at polls, as I was presenting before, most Chileans want to have, again, North Korea or Cuba, they want to have like a sort of social democratic pole. that's 60 to 70% of Chileans, which again is not very revolutionary. It's far away from Allende. I mean, what people want, and people are very in favor of the free market model. That's also what I presented there. People want to have like right to have credit cards and shopping malls. They do want to have all the things, but they just want to have a safety net. That's what they want. And this is why at the end of the day, and this is what the pragmatic right understood, and they say, okay, if we are able to move slowly into that direction, it's not the end of the world. It will be another type of capitalism, but it will be highly capitalist society. I mean, there is no debate about having socialism or something like that. I mean, of course, there are some people with flags about that, but this is not important. And the other and final aspect, the big difference with the left, I would say in the 70s, it's the cultural dimension. This is not only an economic battle. Claudia mentioned that in passing. I mean, it's amazing that the Constituent Assembly that we will have parity. I mean, this is 50% of people are going to be women. This is the only experience in the world. And this has to do with the feminist movement. And the left in the 70s was anything but progressive in this cultural dimension. It has a lot to do with the pressure for indigenous rights. I mean, the left in the 70s didn't care about the Mapuche movement at all. I mean, this is another type of left that is much more fragmented, it's much more complicated, and it's not only about economic struggles. Economic struggles play a big role, but this is not the only part of the story, I would say.
Thank you. I have a question from the audience that I think it's interesting. So let me read it, and please bear with me. How do Chileans today remember the Pinochet era? Accurately, inaccurately, with rose-tinted glasses, or bitterness? Do non-rich young people join the right due to how they remember Pinochet? And the second question is, I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the implications of the Constituency Assembly likely becoming controlled by partisan and elite actors, or figures perceived as such.
About the first question, how do Chileans see the Pinochet era? I think we have less consensus about evaluating the dictatorship than countries like Argentina, for instance. When President Bachelet opened the Museum of Memory, there are parts of Chile who just don't go to that museum. They see it as partisan. They see the denouncing of human rights violation as a partisan issue, not as a shared truth. So I think it's not a resolved thing in Chilean society. There's still some people who have very strong feelings against the socialist attempt, against Allende, against the agrarian reform. There's a huge trauma in the political right that is I think that is weighing heavily in this constitutional debate. There is a right that sees the constitution making process as an expropriatory process where they will lose everything and they will need to go to Miami. So there is that fear. I think it's a minority, but it's still alive. And so I think even culturally, there's still a very big work to be done in Chilean society in bringing that out and discussing it. There's a lot of social pressure of words like saying you are resentful. When they tell you you are resentful, that's a very political adjective. No? If you are resentful, means that you're from the left, and you are resentful against the people that are rich, and there's a lot of connotations about, because this is a very class divided society, and it has remained so. And I think we've had a very deep penetration of some neoliberal ideas that Guzman really wanted that Guzman was successful to insert in Chilean society. All this anti-party, anti-politics discourse is very much what the UDI represented as gremialismo. So it was against the ideological mediation of political parties and in favor of a different kind of mediation based solely on interests and particular interests of gremios, of guilds. No, so the schools' interest, the professional groups' interest, the doctors' interest. And I think that has become a very large common sense in Chile, and it's part of the anti-politics and anti-party discourse So we have a mix of rejection of neoliberalism from within a very neoliberal framework. Also the support for voluntary vote, for instance. You saw like really leftist students saying, how can you force me to vote if I don't want to vote? No. So I think it's a complex, there has been a complex change in Chilean society. Katia Araujo has written about the microsocial interactions among citizens where, for instance, in some periods, people are fine with structural inequality, but can't stand to feel discriminated personally. Things like that. So I think it's not easy to explain, but I think we live under not only under the institutional legacy of the dictatorship, but also with a cultural legacy of 30 years of extreme neoliberalism. The control by elites of the process, I think that's very problematic. As I said before, I think that's the key issue, that of course, the right and the economic interests are trying to control as much as possible the process of change in the constitution making in the convention, and they have a chance to limit the capacity for change. But having said that, I also think that this is really an opening and an enabling process, as Cristobal said before. So there's no way we're going to be as tight as we have been with the dictatorial institution. So no matter how, I mean, even if there's a norm for fiscal balance in the constitution and the autonomy of the central bank and all the things that that the right is really scared not to have in the constitution, even if they remain there will still be inevitably unavoidably, there will be an opening of the political system, and that will enable, I think, politics through elections in the future to create a more progressive agenda in terms of social programs.
Yes, to the two questions. The first about the remembering of the Pinochet era. I tend to agree what Claudia was saying, but maybe I'm a bit more positive in the following sense. My feeling is that Chilean society, and again, it's a bit the picture that I presented at the beginning, Chilean society at the beginning of the 90s was extremely conservative. In moral issues, also was extremely afraid about what is going on. And you had, at the end of the day, almost 40 and something % of the people that voted in favor of Pinochet. That was Chilean society at the beginning of the 1990s. And if you look at Chilean society today, it's completely different. And it has to do with this process of economic modernization that led to a huge cultural transformation. And one of the impacts of that is, of course, you have like a bloc, you have a minority that still thinks about the Pinochet era with nostalgia, but this is a minority within society. I mean, if I will have to put a number, I will bet this is 10, max 20% of the population. And this is what Jos Antonio Cass wants to represent. But if the right follows that track, and this is what I was telling at the beginning, there is no way in which they can govern. There is no way, because the rejection of that sort of project is massive. I mean, it's true that Jos Antonio Cass can mobilize very fervent people behind him, but again, this is a very tiny minority. He was able to get 10% for the previous election, but think that 10% in reality means 5%, but only 50% of the population voted. So again, I mean, in ideal scenario, if he was able to get max whatever, so he will get 10, 15, 20%. So this is a minority that is very powerful because it has a lot of economic power. It connects also very well with some poor people. They're very authoritarian. It's not only wealthy people. There are also people in poor neighborhoods that really want to have mano dura against crime and are very conservative on moral issues. But again, this is a minority within Chilean society. The example that Claudia was saying about the museum that we have, there is a wonderful museum about the cultura del Museo de la Memoria. Piñera, and just as an example, when he came to power, he decided to put a minister, a culture minister, who is, well, terrible. And in fact, one of the issues, he had a book that nobody reads, of course, because he's an intellectual, but an intellectual, nobody reads his book. And one of his books, he said that in fact, that museum, I don't remember the exact word, I don't know if you remember, Claudia, but he said that in fact was a sort of machination made by the government to brainwash or whatever. So, And as soon as journalists started to read the book, and he was the new Ministry of Culture, the pressure from civil society was so big that after 24 hours, he had to resign. And this shows again that Chilean society is much more liberal now. And of course, you have these right-wing blocs, as you have in many other societies. It's not different than in Europe. You have these right-wing actors that are very radical, but they get 10 to 15% of the vote. They made a lot of noise, but if society is able to resist them, I think then I'm not that afraid about that. But this is why I do think that for me, the crucial question is what is going to happen with the right. Whether the right will be able to make a clear distinction between the right-wing bloc to say, okay, we will do a sort of cordon sanitaire, like in the European model, and they say, okay, you are a different type of right, and we are going to be the moderate one. And this is unfolding. I don't know what is going to happen. And this is why I do think that it's quite important to have a look at that sort of dimension, the transformation within the right. The second question about the implications because of this colonization of the Constituent Assembly by parties, I do think, of course, that this is a problem, as we were talking before, because probably at the end of the day, most of the people working in the Constituent Assembly are going to be appointed by political parties. But my feeling is that we will have also a sort of Constituent Assembly that is going to be much more plural than the normal Congress that we have. And in this sense, this is a huge advancement, starting with the issue of parity. I mean, we will have 50% of women. It will end up, we have to see what will happen in Congress, but I bet that we will have also some seats for indigenous people. This is a massive change within Chilean society, that you will have Mapuche people sitting there talking about which type of country do we want to have. And my feeling is also that although civil society will not have massive participation, we will probably have, I don't know the numbers, but let's say 5, 10, 15 people that are very well known from civil society that will be there, and they represent something. So probably for people from outside of Chile don't know, but we have Benito Baranda, who is a very public figure that everybody respects him. He's a guy who is in charge of a charity organization that is very well known. And he's sort of a voice that everybody respects. And probably if he runs, he will get a vote, absolutely. So and I think that sort of figures, if we have sort of small Mandelas, so to say, within our Constituent Assembly, it might be there are only few people. But these few people will have a great voice. So, and if these minorities try to block them, they have symbolic power they can try to mobilize. So my hope then is, of course, political parties will get a lot of power. But if we have a couple of those Mandelas, so to say, to use the metaphor, within the Constituent Assembly, they might not have too many votes, but their symbolic power can be used to try to change the constitutional debate. That's a bit my hope.
Thank you. I have a final question, and it's about the social movement. If the social movement is tired of political parties and the process is going to be controlled by political parties, what do you think will be the support of the social movement to the assembly?
I think that really depends on what the assembly does. But I don't think that the citizens will completely demobilize just because the assembly is working. On the contrary, I think social movements will continue parallel to the constitution making process. And the right is already very concerned about the pressure. They're talking that this is a illegitimate pressure. Of course, without that pressure, none of this would have happened. But I think that there will be a lot of attention from civil society, and particularly from organizations that work on specific topics, the environment, water. Those are environment and water are very broad issues of civil society. And in fact, the areas where the approval for the new constitution won higher votes, over 90%, are precisely the areas in Chile that have been more damaged by industries. So what we call the sacrifice zones where the highest vote was, because one of the main problems of our constitution is the clash between public good and private good. Every time you have a clash between private good and public good, private good wins. That's how it works. When I mentioned the enclaves before, I missed one, which is the Constitutional Tribunal. I forgot to mention it. So in addition to all the institutional clauses we have a constitutional tribunal that has interpreted in a very conservative way and in a way very much oriented to protect entrepreneurial freedom and private property. And it's not a matter of not having entrepreneurial freedom or private property. The problem is when that clashes against the right to education or environment or other considerations of public good. Public good waits almost for nothing in this constitution. And I think that can change in a new constitution, and those social movements that deal with those issues, I think will be particularly active in overseeing what's going on in the convention. And I think that's also why it's very important the way social participation is regulated through the regulation that the convention will need to approve.
Yes, I mean, I completely agree with Claudia. I think the Constituent Assembly will start to work, but I don't think that because of the appearance of the Constituent Assembly, everything will go back to normal, in the sense that people will go working and students will be very clear there and they will not protest. I think it's not going to be that way. And this has to do with a learning process within Chilean society, because political parties in Chile are so detached from what is going on in civil society, and this is a huge mistake from the left. It's not only that right-wing parties are detached from society, it's also the classical left that is completely detached, and even the new left-wing parties, it's not very clear that they have strong roots in society. And because of that, what people understood is the only way in which the political system is going to react is through mobilization. And in this sense, depending on how the Constituent Assembly works, the social movement might get stronger or not. In fact, if the social movement realizes that the Constituent Assembly is moving into a highly conservative direction, of course will people go out to the streets. And on the top of that, we have to think that we still have a right-wing government, that will end in 2 more years. I mean, we have until March 2022. And there is huge pressure for social demands. The whole issue about the Movimiento No Más AFP for the pension system, I mean, people are very upset about the current pension system. So, and the government, I think, probably will have to pass a reform about that. There is no possibility in which they can end their government without a sort of reform. And as soon as this debate will start, people will go out to the street. So in this sense, the good thing about the social movement, or the good thing is that precisely because the social movement is not going to be highly represented in the Constituent Assembly, it's highly likely that the social movement will be very active in the coming months and years. It will not disappear, definitely.
Well, thank you, Claudia, and thank you, Cristobal, for your time. This has been fascinating. We have learned a lot, and I'd like to end up in this optimistic note that what we are saying in Chile is the progressive democratization of society. As you know, for many people all over the world, Chile has a special space because of the whole issue of the Allende process, the Pinochet horrible years, and now these processes of democratization that are happening are fascinating. So I really want to thank you for your time and for sharing with us your knowledge. I am sad that we cannot go and have a pisco sour or a few glasses of wine, but you know, that's life in a pandemic. And I want to thank also our audience and to remind you that Monday at 12, we're going to have an event on what can we learn from other nations where they have had populism in power. So we're going to have Nadia Urbinati, Corguelan, and Margarita Lopez Maya telling us about what happened in other nations where they have populism power, so we can try to start to make sense of the possible outcomes of the US presidential election. So thanks so much. Have a great weekend. Un abrazo.